Hi, everyone. My name is Steph Speirs, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Solstice. And thanks so much for joining us. We wanted to convene our community to talk about the effect of COVID on climate change and the environment. There's a lot changing in the world right now. Every day we get new news about what's happening. And so we wanted to just show you the latest research on this topic and then have Q&A at the end. So a little bit of housekeeping items before we start. So we will be going over this agenda. So first, we're going to talk about the effect of COVID on the environment and carbon emissions, and we're going to talk about the effect on the clean energy industry and the effect on environmental and climate justice. And then talk about what are the implications for this and the economic recovery. In the last 20 minutes of the hour, we'll do Q&A. So before we get started, a couple things to know. Because there's so many people on the line, we have everyone's audio muted for the webinar. But at any time in the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions to Jake and to me. And so all you have to do that is go and type your question into the Q&A on the bottom on the control panel. And then if you see questions that you want to upvote, you can just upvote it in the Q&A section. And at the end of this, we'll take the questions that have the most votes. If you'd like to see, if you have any problems, you can just click the raise your hand button, and Katie from Solstice will reach out to you in a private chat to offer any help. And just so you know, we will be recording this webinar and we'll share the link with everyone who RSVP'd afterwards. Without further ado, I do want to welcome Jake, who you should see on your screen. Hey, Jake. And
hi.
Just so everyone knows who Jake is, Jake's a climate attorney, and he has in the past worked in the Obama White House in the Office of Energy and Climate Change, as well as O-Power, which is a clean tech company that really revolutionized the tech industry in clean energy. And he's also occasionally on MSNBC talking about issues related to climate and sustainability. Welcome, Jake.
Thank you, Steph. I'm sorry that I was Zoom challenged at the beginning. This is my first Zoom panelist.
I know. Yeah, well, we're excited to have you. Glad you got in. And so we'll get started. What we're going to be doing throughout this entire hour is polling the audience. So we're going to practice with a couple of poll questions right now. So the first poll question is, have you been following the rollbacks of federal environmental policy since COVID-19 began? So everyone vote. All right, you should see a screen pop up. And then once you vote, we get to see the results. So you can see that 35% have been following it closely, 54% somewhat following it, 11% not really following it all. Perfect. Great. We'll do the next poll question. And the next question for poll practice is, how often has climate change come up in your conversations with friends and coworkers since COVID-19 began? So vote on your screen. And then we'll be able to see the results. All right, so for just under half of you, climate change has come up a lot in conversations, and the other half talk about it sometimes or not at all. Great, so this is the kind of polling we'll be doing throughout the presentation so that you can have your input and we can hear your thoughts as we're going along, in addition to the last 20 minutes of Q&A. All right, so we'll get started. So the first topic we'll be talking about is really what is COVID's effect on the environment and climate change. And so in each of these kinds of big questions, we'll start with a poll question, and then we'll go over some data and what research is showing on this. And then I'll turn to Jake to get his thoughts. So first poll, has COVID-19 affected your day-to-day environmental practices? Yes, somewhat, no? Okay. So this poll shows that over 60% of people have changed their day-to-day environmental practices because of it. And you know, with COVID and the concern around the contagion effect of the virus, we've seen people use fewer reusable bags. Cities have called off recycling and composting programs because they can't get enough workers to work those programs. And ultimately, the question that I want to raise for Jake at the end of this is there's a debate in climate around whether individual behavior or systemic policy change is what we should be focusing our time on. And we'll return to that question. First, some data. So this is data that comes from NASA, and this shows a 2015 to 2019 average in March of nitrogen dioxide levels in the Northeast. And so darker shades areas show higher nitrogen dioxide, which basically means that there is more pollution because nitrogen dioxide is emitted for burning fossil fuels for transportation and electricity usage. So this is the average from 2015 to 2019. Well, what did it look like in 2020? This is the average from March of 2020. And you can see from the previous slide to this slide, air pollution in the Northeast has gone down 30%. And that's why you're seeing on social media a lot of pictures like this. You're seeing people say, look, I can see blue skies for the first time in New Delhi or in LA. And you've also seen a lot of stories about animals coming back to rule the planet. And this is a picture of swans in Venice. As it turns out, this picture was debunked, even though it went viral. A lot of the pictures you've seen on social media talking about the return of animals have been debunked in terms of Venice always had swans in this particular area. But because the internet is what it is, we started seeing more of these memes. Buffalo, the earth is healing, we are the virus. Chicago, bean babies have returned, the earth is healing, we are the virus. And we are the virus, the earth is healing. So there's a lot of confusion about the effects on the environment. One thing we can say is that with less travel, with less air travel, less car travel, carbon emissions is down. And the thing about seeing how other countries who have gotten the virus earlier are reacting can give us a view into what's happening in the future. So this is what's happened in China in terms of air pollution levels. So on the left, you see nitrogen dioxide levels in China. And during the peak of the virus, you see nitrogen dioxide decreasing, but then you see that it's come up back to normalized levels since then. And on the right, you see the same thing happening with the consumption of coal. First, during the peak virus levels in China, you saw coal consumption going down as human demand goes down for coal and energy, but then it's coming back up. And Nature just published a study that showed that carbon dioxide emissions levels rebounded very quickly after the last global financial crisis. In fact, even though we saw a decrease in 2008 and 2009 of carbon emissions, in 2010, we reached an all-time high level. So what we're seeing from the data is that carbon emissions bounces back. And what experts are predicting is that in 2020, we'll see a 5.5% drop in CO2. And yet, this is not going to have an impact on climate unless we make this change long lasting. In order to affect climate change, we have to hit 7.6% decrease in carbon emissions per year for the next decade. So coronavirus is having some effect, but it's not having enough of an effect. And so I want to turn to Jake to comment about how is COVID affecting the environment and climate change.
Thank you, Steph. And let me just first say that it's really nice to join you over Zoom and to join everybody. And I really appreciate the chance to be a part of this, but also just what you're doing. I think that Solstice has contributed so much value to this discussion over the years, particularly around what communities and individuals can be doing to improve the environment, to help sort of do their part on the broader climate crisis. And I love the way that you've pivoted to this sort of community-based discussion and gathering as best as we can do in light of the circumstances. So thank you so much for creating this opportunity and for including me. So, this is an interesting question. A lot of people have asked, what are the similarities? What are the differences between what's happening with this virus and our environment? And I think, obviously the slides that you showed illustrate what has happened as a result of basically stopping the economy. And our economy runs on a lot of fuels and sources of power that, as a byproduct, cause pollution. And even though we have come a very long way, even in recent years, to both decarbonize our economy and also just address more conventional sources of pollution, we've seen, quite dramatically that, in fact, we still have quite a long way to go. I live in Los Angeles, and I don't know that I've ever seen the city so clean in my entire life. And it's stunning, but I do feel a little bit of a sense of foreboding that this is just temporary, and we're going to see an uptick in pollution when we start to turn the corner on the economy, which I think begs the question, what can we do to try to preserve some of these cleaner and healthier landscapes that we're now all getting a little bit more accustomed to? And I think that one important question to ask is, well, why did we stop the economy? It might be a little bit obvious now that we're all sort of, staying at home and doing our part to flatten the curve. But this pandemic has something in common with some of the broader environmental issues that we face, which is illustrated in the answer to the question of why did we stop the economy? And the basic answer about why we stopped the economy was because we missed the chance to stop the virus. There are ways to plan and prepare for these types of global pandemics. And we've seen previous examples where that has happened, whether that's with the H1N1 virus or with the Ebola virus. And with this pandemic, either because there was a lack of planning or preparation, or a lack of seriousness of purpose in our leadership, or maybe this virus is just so swift and so contagious that nobody would have stood a chance against any realistic planning effort. The bottom line is, right now, where we find ourselves is reacting to a scenario where we didn't adequately contain the virus. And the only way to stop it is to separate from each other. And the only way to separate from each other is to sort of grind the gears of the economy to a slow. And I think that provides a helpful analog to what we're thinking about in terms of climate change. We now know, the science has been crystallized over the last few years. And if you take a look at the latest national climate assessment from the Trump administration, or sort of similar reports that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or even California does its own reporting, we now know that one of the critical elements of how we're going to plan to tackle this climate crisis is the question of time, and that we only have a finite amount of time left before we will start to see irreversible changes in our environment, many of which may have already occurred. So, I think that even though these are different problems, I think that we can draw on some of their similarities in the idea of time and preparation, and what it means to actually be planning ahead for sort of a public health and scientific eventuality that we know is going to come. With climate change, ironically, we have much more of a head start. The writing is on the wall, the changes are occurring, and it's just up to us to be able to start reacting. And I think that leads to the question that you teed up at the beginning, which is, well, what do we do? Is this a collective action problem? Is this something that we as individuals could do? I was really surprised actually by the poll. And I don't know if we're sort of self-selecting here a little bit in terms of an audience of people who may be more inclined to change their environmental behaviors in light of the virus. But I was surprised that 62% or so of people said that they actually did. That's wonderful. That's great. And I know that, you know, if you count just staying home all day and not getting in the car and not flying as environmental behaviors, then I think maybe the answer should be 100%. But, you know, there is this debate in the climate community, which is this a problem for the individual? Do we have to change our behavior? Or is this something that we need to, you know, ask our systems, our governments, our corporations, and larger organizations to take a leadership role on in changing? And I think one of the like emblematic examples of that might be something like travel. You know, we all want to travel. We all want to get in the car and go recreate and see friends and see family. It's nice to be able to jump on a flight and make it to a wedding or make it to a graduation. But as an individual who's taking responsibility to reduce their carbon footprint, should you be limiting those types of activities? And some people might say, yes, that is, you know, incumbent upon all humans. We now know that this is a crisis and we have to stop using less of these technologies that create climate pollution. And there's another camp of people who say, no, that's not, it shouldn't, the burden shouldn't fall on you and it shouldn't fall on me. It should fall on the airlines. They should be decarbonizing by using low carbon fuels. They should be investing in zero carbon technology to power our airplanes and investing in electric aviation. And similarly, you know, the car companies, they ought to be the ones providing choices to consumers that are actually carbon free. And they shouldn't be imposing these burdens on individuals. And I think that that's a healthy debate to have. My personal take on this is that there's some things that everybody can and should be doing, and there's some things that companies can and should be doing. And oftentimes, because, you know, we have markets that don't necessarily produce the right outcomes for maximizing sort of social well-being or public health, that sometimes we need to have governments and regulatory agencies step in to help push those companies and corporations along to help provide those types of choices for consumers.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from you and is reflected in this statistic in front of us here is that even if we take all of our individual actions to stop travel and not get in a car, it's not going to be enough to affect climate change. And so this is really an opportunity to change our systems, like you said, and figure out how do we get to that 7.6% decrease in carbon emissions per year for the next decade, such that we can mitigate climate change.
Yeah.
And
sorry, I did want to just add, you know, I would say that prior to the coronavirus crisis, I had probably on balance fell more into the camp of, you know, this is something that we should reasonably be able to ask institutional actors in our society to take the lead on more than individuals. But I think that actually one thing that this virus and experience with the pandemic has changed for me is really seeing for the first time in my lifetime what it actually means to be sort of a meaningful part of a collective, and what the power of collective action can actually look like. And I think, you know, maybe for our parents or our grandparents who lived through world wars or who lived through sort of the heightened sort of fears and anxieties of something like the Cold War, that you know, they maybe understand in a more innate way that type of a feeling. But I think it's really important for young people, millennials and younger people, to be going through this experience to say, well, actually, if we all do come together, we can solve this problem. We can repurpose, you know, our sewing factories to be making masks, and we can repurpose the automakers to be producing ventilators. And it really echoes, I think, a lot of the collective action that we know about from the history of something like building the arsenal of democracy during World War II. But we haven't had that tangible experience. And I also think that it points to the importance of having a government that's able to inspire that type of collective action in the people. And so, you know, for me, I think we all can learn a lot about both of these sides of this debate, you know, what people can do as individuals and also how companies can play their part and institutional actors can play their part.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the other questions about when we're talking about the effects of COVID on climate change is really how does it affect the clean energy industry? And so next poll question for everyone, do you think COVID-19 will help or hinder the clean energy industry? So quick check to what the audience thinks. And then I'll present some data about how it has affected the industry in the last month. All right, so kind of split here. 2/3 think it'll help, and about 1/3 thinks it will hinder the clean energy industry. So thanks everyone for participating. This is what is happening to the oil industry. If you've been watching the news about the price volatility largely set by Saudi Arabia and Russia's supplies to the global oil supplies, you see in 2020, and this comes from the International Energy Agency, hot off the press, they predict that oil demand will go down in 2020 for the first time in a long time. And that's obviously because people are traveling less, people are participating in less economic activity, but they do predict a very high increase in subsequent years. And that trend line over time is the dotted line that you see is decreasing over time. Generally, the global demand for oil is going down. Okay, well, that's oil. How does this affect the clean energy industry? In March 2020, unfortunately, all of the clean energy sectors lost about 100,000 jobs. And it's not just, you know, some of the bigger companies like Sungevity and SunPower announced large layoffs, but it's also smaller companies as well. And in our discussions with solar developers and energy developers, they've talked about how their financing might be up in the air because the capital markets are so unpredictable at the moment. And also they're worried about supply chain disruptions. You know, can they procure the steel racking? Can they procure the solar panels, the windmills to actually build their clean energy facilities? So I want to turn to Jake again and ask, you know, what are your thoughts about the effect of COVID on the renewables and clean energy industry specifically in light of all this data?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think it's also something that we should circle back to when we talk a little bit about sort of what this recovery might look like and what types of investments we want to make as a society. On the sort of economics of what's happening in the energy industry, it's hard to know. You know, a lot of people, a lot of sort of analysts and experts and folks in the industry who follow this very closely have indicated that they believe, you know, that we although we are now experiencing the largest disruption to the energy industry and possibly to the economy since the Great Depression, and potentially even larger than that, that things will tend to go back. You know, the reason that we are no longer demanding oil in the same way that we are before is because, you know, again, that we've shut down the economy, and the economy, particularly transportation, is really a sector that depends on oil to power our cars and trucks and planes and shipping. And so, you know, as that starts to tick back up, we'll see demand tick back up as well. But I think one of the interesting questions is sort of like, well, what happens now that so many companies and firms within this industry are going to be sort of navigating a price of oil that is now flirting with, I think, below $20 a barrel. And, you know, the way that this, a lot of these projects work is based on, you know, future revenues and profits that are derived from how much you can sell oil for. And so, you know, I think The Economist was reporting last week that once oil reaches about $35 a barrel, certain energy projects look less attractive than they looked before. And well, from the climate front, this may be a positive development for certain very expensive and very heavily polluting projects. I'm thinking about things like the tar sands in Canada, which require just a huge amount of energy to extract. And therefore, when you finally get that oil, the only way to really profitably sell it is if you're closer to $75 or $100 a barrel. And don't quote me, because I don't know the right price for that, but it's definitely a lot higher than $35 and certainly higher than $20. And so there will be projects that environmentalists would be happy to see go away because they're no longer economically competitive. And at the same time, for clean energy, that means that a number of sort of relatively inexpensive solar projects or wind projects or battery storage projects that may not have been able to compete previously with fossil fuel projects will now be more competitive. And so in a way, there may be sort of a brighter story for some clean energy projects that now look a little bit more economically competitive. I think it does cut in the other direction as well, though, because we know from the past, and I think history can be a helpful indicator here, looking at something like the Great Recession or the previous recessions in the 80s and the oil shocks in the 70s, that when the price of oil goes down, it also sort of provides an inherent subsidy to use oil products. And so, buying a gallon of gasoline now in the United States is super inexpensive. So people may, when we start to come out of this, they may feel more inclined to be driving more. They may be less interested in purchasing fuel efficient vehicles or electric vehicles because people are very responsive to the price of a gallon of gasoline. And I think all indications are that those prices are going to be pretty depressed for a long time. So it's kind of too early to really know the answers on all of this, but you can see the ways in which it kind of cuts in both directions.
Got it. And, one of the ways that the COVID crisis is having a significant effect is excuse me, someone at my door, is on the environmental justice community. So how do marginalized communities, how are they affected by this? Well, we have another poll question. Do people think that COVID helps or hinders environmental justice aims? All right, poll results say that disproportionate, 70% of people think that it hinders environmental justice. And we'll look at some of the data around this because they've just come out in the last week. We've heard that African Americans have a higher disproportionate morbidity rate due to their having pre-existing conditions like respiratory issues, diabetes, obesity, that affect the mortality rate. And we also have seen the study that just came out from Harvard, where on the left, you show a county level 17-year average of fine particulate matter. So that's linked to air pollution levels all across the United States. So the darker regions, red regions you see have higher fine particulate matters. And this is again, a 17-year average on a county level. On the right is a map of the county level of deaths from COVID-19 per 1 million population in the United States. So the darker areas you can see are the areas that are more affected by COVID in terms of mortality rates. And this Harvard study showed statistically significantly that a tiny increase in fine particulate matter actually yields a 15% increase in the COVID death rate, meaning air pollution affects whether or not you can survive COVID. And so the populations that are affected are also not just the ones affected by air pollution, but this is a map put together by Javion, which is a healthcare data company, as well as Microsoft partnered with them on this map. This map shows the communities that are most vulnerable to COVID-19 based on death rates across the country. And they found that they looked at a lot of factors, including socioeconomic factors, lack of access to transportation, exposure to toxins, unemployment, mortality rates. And they found the biggest risk factor was air quality. So when we're talking about the people who are most affected by the systems of energy and the environment that have existed for the last few decades, continue to be the most affected by COVID. So it sounds like the answer to the question is that it's not helpful to environmental justice. It hinders it. But Jake, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the things I think the coronavirus has been called by a lot of people sort of this so-called great equalizer, in the sense that it will kill rich people, it will kill poor people, it will kill the famous, and it'll kill the anonymous. But it also has really laid bare these deep structural inequities in our society that existed long before the virus came. And I think that one of those structural inequities is this sort of scourge of air pollution. And we know, that the communities that are most likely to be burdened by something like particulate matter pollution, but also all different kinds of air pollution, ozone and smog, the lead, mercury. I mean, you can go through the list. That these are frontline and sort of fence line communities that are disproportionately communities of color. They're disproportionately low-income communities. They're communities that don't have the same amount of political influence as a richer, more affluent, more white communities. And so I don't know that it would be necessarily so accurate to say that, we should look at this study, because it is clear that, if you are a person who has been confronting air pollution in your community, and now you are a person who is confronting coronavirus, you are more likely to die. I mean, full stop. And that should be a very powerful lesson. But I think, it would be a mistake to sort of pin all of this on coronavirus. And I think instead, it's an opportunity for us to look at some of these underlying issues and talk about, well, why is it that we have predominantly communities of color that are dealing with air pollution? And you can look back into the historical sort of racial injustices and track all the way back to something like the practice of discriminatory redlining in communities that disallowed people of color from living in cleaner and healthier and safer parts of town that may have had more access to clean air and access to outdoor space and recreation. And all of this is so sort of complex and interrelated, but I think that what this virus has provided for us is an opportunity to start unraveling that and teasing out each of these sort of specific systemic inequities so that we can start addressing them piece by piece. And I think I would just sort of add that all of this, I think the Harvard study is important in the sense that it indicates one specific example. If it looked at the delta of 1 unit of particulate matter pollution higher in one county versus another. But actually, a lot of disadvantaged communities that are dealing with particulate matter pollution, they're not dealing with 1 unit. They're dealing with 5 units. They're dealing with a dozen units. They're dealing with short-term exposure in addition to long-term exposure. They're dealing with low levels, which we know from people like the American Lung Association and other peer-reviewed scientific reports, that's also deadly. The report also didn't look at these other sources of air pollution. And so, I hesitate to get sort of political, and I don't know that this is a political point, but I would just point out that as this data is coming to light in the context of the coronavirus, we are also watching the EPA sort of decline to take up these matters in a way that it has the ability to do so through regulation. Those particulate matter pollution standards were recently under review at EPA. And last week, the agency decided that they were going to maintain the same standards that have been in place for nearly a decade. So even as new studies have come to light showing a number of reasons that those standards might, merit a review, they aren't likely to be reviewed anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is that the things that affect our public health affect the health of the planet as well, and there's a symbiotic relationship between those things. And just for the interest of time, I want to get to people's questions, and thank you for continuing to propose questions and upvoting them. Our last kind of poll question for the team is, do you think a green stimulus will help or hinder economic recovery? And inherent into this question is this what Jake talked about with the EPA kind of calling off last week a lot of the regulations protecting the environment, and the fact that the stimulus bill, the CARES Act that was passed, didn't have any component of climate change. It did include a bailout of the airline industry, which is suffering a lot of job losses, but specifically nothing for the clean energy or renewables industry. So we'll see what the poll results are. All right, so most people think a green stimulus will help the economic recovery. This is probably a group of people who would believe that because they are choosing to spend their Thursday afternoon with us talking about the environment. But let's look a little bit at the data real quick. So this is actually a graph of in Germany. What you see in blue is the climate change is a debate topic in the German parliament, and then the red is the financial crisis. So you see climate change is a debate topic, dropped sharply in the German parliament in the wake of the financial crisis. So there's something about the financial crisis that makes people say, okay, let's talk about climate change later. In other news, though, we see that a survey just came out, put out by Data for Progress, that polled people across the political spectrum. And what they found was that there is a support for public investments in green solutions. Everything stemming from renewable energy to battery technology to electric vehicles to agriculture. So the public supports this, and yet we didn't actually see any green action in the last CARES Act. So when we think about how do we recover from this, how do we move on, and how do we also make sure we're helping climate change? Jake, what are some of in your minds, the lessons that we can learn from this experience and moving forward?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and something I think we're going to see playing a larger role in the public debate as Congress, continues to consider possible recovery measures. And I think one helpful way of thinking about this is, rather than maybe calling it sort of a green stimulus or a green recovery, is to talk about it in terms of resilience. What we need is a resilient recovery. And it's just been amazing. In retrospect, it's really only been a matter of weeks, but I think that we have seen just how quickly the current economy that we've been living in has been susceptible to this type of disruption, and how quickly things can fall apart. And so, as we rebuild, I think it will be really paramount to be also laying a foundation for a more resilient economy that can withstand this kind of disruption, and that can help to position families and communities specifically to withstand this kind of disruption. I think today we got the news that another 5 or 6 million people filed for unemployment, bringing the total over 20 million Americans which have now claimed unemployment benefits, which is unprecedented. And there are going to need to be a lot of jobs in any recovery that we have. You mentioned on a previous slide that out of the millions of jobs that have been lost, we've seen over 100,000 clean energy jobs specifically that have been lost. And there will be opportunities to put people back to work in those industries. We also need to be smart about the kinds of crises and disruptions that we should be planning for in the future. And as we've indicated before, we know that climate change is a major disruption looming around the corner, another multi-trillion-dollar disruption. And we know that we only have a certain amount of time to contain our carbon emissions at the levels required to avert the most serious consequences. And so as this government starts planning for a recovery, I think it would be reasonable to think about infusing its recovery sort of principles in the ideas of climate resilience, mitigation of carbon emissions, and opportunities to create jobs for people who can participate in that mission. There are millions of clean energy jobs that are available in this economy, whether that's installing solar panels, whether that's manufacturing batteries for electric vehicles and stationary storage, whether that's building wind turbines and wind turbine towers, whether it's working on energy efficiency. And I think that it would be a big missed opportunity if we came out the other end of this crisis and did not make very deliberate and thoughtful investments in putting people back to work, doing that type of job that we know can help lead us to a more resilient place in the future, so that when we do confront these crises again, we're not left so flat-footed. The other thing that I would just say, which is not necessarily a climate answer, but I think is indicative of some of the broader systemic and structural problems that we face in the climate crisis, is that when we recover, we should be less focused on short-term profit. A lot of the reasons a number of the reasons for which we are experiencing this economic disruption is that a lot of companies are used to working on a quarterly basis. When I was at OPower, we always had to deliver quarterly reports, annual results in a way that the market would deem our company to have been successful. And that was to have a certain amount of growth over a certain short period of time. But when we value growth at the expense of something like public health, or at the expense of inherently valuable things like clean air and clean water, we sacrifice some of that resilience that we need as a society to withstand these types of disruptions. And so I think it would also be helpful and interesting for our lawmakers and policymakers to be considering, how do we imbue this type of recovery with the indicators of long-term economic health and long-term sustainability that doesn't just incentivize corporations and organizations to be seeking short-term gains at the expense of something like public health or the environment. And there are going to be plenty of opportunities to do that.
Yeah, and some of their questions from the audience are addressing that. And so I want to get to Q&A. In the bottom of your control panel, you'll see a list of questions, and you can upvote any questions that you want to get answered. So we'll start from the top with the most number of votes. The first question is, can working from home prove profitable enough for companies to choose to downsize an office space and still result in a measurable decrease in vehicular carbon emissions?
Are we fielding these together, or do you want me to take the first crack?
Oh, I, as host, broadcasting from Pinterest, I would turn to you for the first answer, and then I.
Okay. This is a really interesting question that a lot of different organizations are now grappling with. I think a lot of people, are experiencing this ability to work from home and from Zoom and to have meetings sort of potentially in relatively more convenient places. I know a lot of people are also dying to get out of the house. And it's, to me, this seems like sort of a company culture question. For example, in my law firm, it's really important that people have an office that they can go to in order to not only get their work done, but to, sort of have those hallway conversations with their colleagues and check in with people and develop relationships at work that are valuable both for, personal social reasons, but also because it's good to have, positive working relationships with the people that you work with. And I think a lot of companies, this is purely anecdotal, but having just debated this question with friends and colleagues over the last weeks, I think a lot of companies will be more open to the idea of more flexible work from home policies and standards and practices in a way that could help us ultimately reduce vehicular carbon emissions. But again, I think that the other thing that this question points to is, should we live in a world where going to the office necessarily creates a negative carbon impact? And my answer to that question is no. And as a result, we should also be living in a world where auto companies and consumers are incentivized to purchase vehicles that don't contribute to carbon pollution.
Yeah, great point. And we can definitely decrease our vehicular carbon emissions, but there's a lot other stuff we can do to change the system as well. And so just to keep things moving along and get as many questions answered, I'm going to move to the next question. And it comes from Wells. Can you see the global economic structure changing because of quality of life revelations coming out of COVID to focus less on indefinite GDP growth and more on sustainable investments?
I hope so. I think, it's been interesting to watch the way that the stock market has tended to move like this, even as we've had record unemployment filings and just personal pain in society. And I think if ever there was a moment to appreciate the concept that the markets no longer reflect the reality on the ground for a majority of Americans, it may be now. And I think that there will be a lot of scholarship and research building on what is already a wealth of literature around this question. And there have been some really interesting interventions, like, for example, corporations that are able to incorporate and file as a B Corp as a way to signal their intention to, contribute to longer term social indicators of wealth and well-being and health, instead of this sort of more conventional notions of GDP and growth that we see in typical corporation structures. There are also, I think, some really interesting sort of research and writing now that I've seen about how we think about fortifying ourselves against these types of future disruptions, which would include the notion of asking our corporations to make sure that they have a system for kind of saving for a rainy day, as it were. We've got so many individuals that if you are out of money right now, you're out of luck. You can't just declare bankruptcy and restructure. So there, a law school classmate of mine, actually, Dorothy Shapiro, just published in the New York Times an op-ed on this very question, seeking for companies and states to require that companies put in place better governance practices that account for these types of disruptions in the future. And I think that, if you are a person who has innovative ideas or thoughts about how to campaign around some of these ideas, now is a good time to be introducing those into the bloodstream, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. And, in terms of this question, we are seeing that there is a trade-off between overemphasizing the short-term expediency and profitability of our economy versus the long-term health of our society and our planet. And another, I'm just going to keep going through questions, try to get as many answered here. Another question that someone had was really around carbon capture, sequestration, carbon removal technology. So how do you feel about carbon capture and its role in reducing emissions?
This is an important question. A lot of folks sort of in the progressive climate world would argue, you know, hey, we shouldn't be focused on carbon capture because what it really means is that we're perpetuating the use of fossil fuels and assuming that we'll be able to develop this technology to capture all of the emissions and stick them underground, which we actually, in fact, don't yet have. And I think that where that sentiment comes from is this very important notion that we need to be transitioning to cleaner sources of energy that don't emit and that don't create this problem of having to capture the pollution and bury it somewhere. But I will also say that if we are going to reach the targets articulated by the international community and try to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming, or at least 2 degrees of warming, we need every single solution on the table. We cannot afford to be dismissive of one or the other. And if we can develop a technology to capture carbon from power plants that are currently operating, or to remove carbon from the atmosphere in a way that seems currently, you know, physically impossible, we should be doing that. And so I think, you know, all solutions need to be on the table.
Yep. And actually, the environmental EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, did research into looking to see that in order to achieve our climate mitigation goals, so to reduce carbon emissions in time to reverse some of the effects of climate change, we do need actual carbon removal technologies to be accelerated, because our levels of carbon are so high right now that we have to get negative emissions in order to reach our goals. So what about next question? Do you think climate change and environmental degradation help to produce a virus like COVID? Do you think we will continue to see pandemics like this if the climate keeps changing?
So there's an interesting article on this in the Washington Post today. And basically what it says is that, you know, the short answer is no, but the long answer is that, you know, when you have a virus that gets transmitted via animal to human, that there are a number of really interconnected ways in which we have allowed for the deterioration of our environment to potentially accelerate that kind of transmission. And those are, you know, things ranging from habitat destruction, which forces animals into sort of more human and urban environments, all the way to just creating more of I suppose, sort of a riper environment, generally speaking, for the transmission of viral diseases. I think most sort of scientists and people who focus on the transmission of disease would also tell you that one of the anticipated impacts of climate change and a warmer world is that you increase the number of disease vectors, meaning things that can carry a disease and therefore spread its transmission. And so even if this virus proves to have not been a result of climate change, which it seems on the face of it that it's not, we should nonetheless be worried about the way in which climate change will increase the transmission of disease over time.
And I know we could spend a while talking about this, but we're nearing the end of our time. And so just want to do a little bit of wrap up about some of what we heard. And thank you everyone for your participation in the polls and the Q&A. Obviously we could talk a lot more about this stuff, and we're really scratching the surface. And we are not trying to predict the future. We're just trying to present the best data for you and demonstrate that in light of all of these COVID actions and focus that everyone has right now, that we have to keep the climate change in the back of our minds, because even when COVID is all over, we'll be dealing with the effects of climate change for years to come. what I find really encouraging about this moment is that it is such a striking kind of rebirth of society right now, that we have the opportunity to do better than we have in the past. We have the opportunity to try to stimulate the economy again using green infrastructure projects as opposed to subsidizing fossil fuels, which reached an all-time high in 2018, by the way. And ultimately, Jake, I'll turn it to you to kind of any last words in a minute before closing out. But what is bringing you hope right now about this moment when we talk about COVID's effects on the climate?
Yeah, well, I would just echo your sentiments, Steph. I think you're absolutely right that, we now have this opportunity to take stock of where we are, where we've been, and where we want to go. And, this is a painfully challenging experience for humanity and for our country and for our communities. But I think it really does put into pretty stark relief the things that matter. And those are your health, not your money. They are your family and the people who are close to you. And they're the idea that when we work together and towards a common goal and towards a common mission, we can actually do remarkable things. And for me, it's just been incredibly inspiring to see that. And I know that if we are able to mobilize the same kind of spirit towards this climate crisis that we face, that in the same way that we've been able to flatten the curve and save lives around the country on coronavirus, we can also, bend the climate curve, as it were, and reduce our emissions and save lives from air pollution and from the impacts of climate change. And I think that this will have been a really important learning opportunity at the end of the day for us to be able to draw from in that fight in the future.
Yeah, and as MLK said, we're all caught up in an inescapable web of mutuality. And if something affects us directly, it affects us all indirectly. And climate change shows that, this pandemic shows that. And I want to close out in thanking everyone for taking the time on a Thursday afternoon to have this conversation with us, to use technology to interact with us. And this is what Solstice is all about. We're all about community. We connect households and businesses to community solar farms in their area. And we're actually running a special offer. If you live in New York, if you sign up for Community Solar, which is free energy savings, no cost, it only saves you money to take advantage of Community Solar. We give everyone $100 to sign up, and we'll donate another $100 to a local COVID-19 relief nonprofit. So learn more and sign up at solstice.us/Earth Day, or you could visit any of our social media channels at Solar for Good. And I want to thank Jake. Thank you so much for taking your time. I know things are crazy on your end, as with everyone in the world, but you made time to help educate us a little bit about how to think about this period and how to be better policymakers and advocates in the days and weeks ahead. So thank you.
Thank you, Steph. I really appreciate the chance.
Have a good rest of your day, everyone. Bye.